Remuseum is a museum think tank focused on issues of relevance, financial sustainability, and governance. It was inspired and funded by David Booth, who's going to join us today in partnership with Alice Walton and Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, with additional support from the Ford Foundation and the Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation. Remuseum looks at those topics and supports them in two ways. One, we generate research and share data and insights around relevance, financial sustainability, and governance. And two, we support the leaders who are at the cutting edge of finding new solutions to these critical issues. We do those in lots of ways, one of which is hosting convenings. Two of those have been held at Paradox Cove, the home of David Booth and Heather Pizzanti in Austin, Texas, which is not just an extraordinarily museum-like setting itself, but an inspired site for innovative thinking. And what we're going to hear today are case studies that came out of a convening held in January at Paradox Cove of this year. And it was about collections. Collections are the treasures of museums. They preserve cultural heritage, they give us something to study, they draw audiences. If you look at museum press releases and annual reports, they're just about the biggest thing that museums celebrate when they add to their collections. And there are always important reasons to be adding to museum collections, whether it's finding new forms of art and the art of our time to add to them, whether it's filling gaps represented by types of artists, regions, media that were underrepresented in museum collections before, or adding that occasional extraordinary masterpiece that will become a crowning jewel in the collection. At the same time, those growing collections, especially when every object is owned 100% by each museum, most of which is rarely seen, present their own costs. And that's what we're here to talk about today. So let's start with the data. And I'm going to share some numbers that we've been able to compile from very limited resources. One of the things we've shown is the field needs a lot more data. But really quickly, we estimate that in 2025, the 200 largest art museums in America collectively own about 18 million objects. It's interesting as we get to that number in part by extrapolating back to 1988 for some reasons about studies that took place then that I don't have time to go into today. But what it shows is 36 years represented a doubling of these collections, or a 2% growth rate. And that is about right when you look at what's happening. And what that means, of course, is that inexorable and very steady growth rate, if you know compounding interest, will lead to a doubling every 36 years. And so there is no reason not to think that those same 200 museums in America will have 36 million objects 36 years from now, which is a lot. Now let's look at the cost of collections, where the data is even less clear. And I have to be honest, we're doing our best to try to make even a ballpark estimate of what it costs for museums to maintain these collections. There's a very important PhD dissertation written in 2002, which actually goes back to the same number, 1988, which is why it's become sort of important. And in that, a researcher named Ann Stone uses a methodology developed by the museum architect George Hartman to estimate that museum collections at that time cost $200 million a year to maintain. If you simply multiply by the rate of inflation growth since then and the doubling of those collections, you get to $1.1 billion today. If you go back to George Hartman's actual methodology, it actually leads to a much bigger number, which is the number at the top, which actually takes, he was the first one to show you had to do something to account for the cost of capital, the cost of building that space, not just using it every year. And I took his number and I generated it, and it was so outrageous I cut it in half, assuming that half the objects cost nothing, maybe are works of paper and cost nothing to store, which is excessively conservative, but you get to 2.8 billion. Now in Goldilocks fashion, we're gonna look at the number in the middle, because there's only one museum I know of in America, a major regional museum, that about 7 or 8 years ago entered to a very intense study of what it cost to store the art in its collection. And it was the first one that attributed indirect costs, the people costs of maintaining and storing the artwork. And at that time, they estimated that across their very large collection, it was costing them $106 per object to maintain the art every year. If you multiply that by 18 million objects and add a little bit for inflation from the time of that study, you get to $2.4 billion a year. I don't know what the right answer is, but you're looking at something I think many of you in this room probably feel, which is $2.4 billion looks a lot like about 50% or more of the annual operating budgets of these 200 museums. And at some point, I'm not here to say whether it's unsustainable or not now, at some point the encroachment onto the museum's ability to generate its other mission-based programs is going to become quite serious. And that's what we're kind of here to talk about. I want to talk about another study. So the folks from SF MoMA are doing an important event out there that I think Christie's partnering with them on today. But they're doing a couple things very interesting. Really quickly, SF MoMA has an accessions committee, like many museums, but they also have set up a new committee called the Collections Committee, who is a formal board committee whose job is to study the storage and utilization of the collection, separate from the acquisitions. As you know, many boards feel like they take a lot of work in, but they never talk about what's actually happening to it. And what they have found is that it's really interesting as they study their collection, because we look at numbers of objects and square footage. SF MoMA is looking at cubic feet, which is really a much more accurate number to look at. And what they're finding, they're actually grading every object in the collection from XX small to XX large. And they're finding the majority of the works they've acquired over the last 10 years are quite large, meaning that the problems are even greater, frankly, than we've estimated. One way to look at acquisitions is that they actually represent an allocation of future budget expenses towards each acquisition you make. And here's one way to think about it. The average museum maybe has 10,000 objects. There is no average, but that means they would add 200 objects a year. If you use the Goldilocks formula, that means that would cost them about $25,000 a year to maintain, which represents an allocation of $500,000 to $600,000 of their endowment to storing those year's acquisitions in perpetuity. Now, there are museums starting to ask donors to actually fund the perpetual maintenance and storage and utilization of the collections, but most objects are not covered in that way. So every museum needs to think more thoughtfully, and they are thinking more thoughtfully about it. As I said, the purpose of this gathering is not to suggest that museums should stop adding work to their collections. It is too important for many, many reasons. But the purpose is to recognize and celebrate ways that some leaders and institutions are finding new ways to own, acquire, care for, share for, and capture the value of these collections that form their very heart. So everything you see here is going to be in a report we've issued now. It's on our website. You can access it through the QR code on your program. If you're on Remuseum's newsletter list, you're going to get a copy of it by email right at the end of this event. And you're free to access and share it.